Today, I'm gonna go over how to set up for a ceremony when you're shooting video at a wedding. Today, I have 5 different cameras in total, plus a second shooter, so technically 6. I didn't really need to use more than that, or else I could have had my second shooter use a couple of their cameras as well, but I just had them on one main camera. So I wanted to just go over how I set things up and what I did to set up for the ceremony so that if you are new to weddings or want to learn more about setting up for ceremonies, especially if you're a solo shooter, this should help you. So the first thing I did was simply just set up my tripods and got everything kind of set up so that I could just pop my cameras on and go from there. This is, just a tedious portion of setting up. And one thing to note here is that I'm using 4 tripods with 4 cameras, one on each tripod, and then I have a handheld rig that I use as my main camera that'll be getting the, normal shots, like you're walking on the aisle and stuff like that. You can do it on a gimbal as well. I chose handheld because I prefer that look, but those are the cameras I'm using. So you could use more cameras, you could potentially use less, but obviously when you're shooting a wedding, the more the better, so you have a lot of angles covered, especially when people try to walk in front of your shot, or the photographer gets in front of your shot, or even you walk in front of your own shot. The more cameras, the better. So as I'm setting up these cameras, one thing to note is to make sure you have a really good amount of both tight and wide lenses. Because I have 4 different cameras, I have about 2 of each. I have a few zoom lenses here as well as a stationary 85mm, but for the most part, you wanna make sure you have a good mixture of wide and tight lenses because it'll allow you to have more versatility and it looks much nicer when you edit. Whether that be in your highlight film or a full ceremony film, you wanna have a good versatility of different shots and different angles so that you can have a good mix so it doesn't all look kind of the same. The next thing here, I'm putting on some mics. I have some shotgun mics that I put on a few of my cameras. Any camera that I'm going to have close to the front of the area that someone's getting married, I'll put a shotgun. Any camera that's going to be really far away in the back, usually I'll put my receiver for my wireless mic on that, and then I'll have wireless mics on a few people like the officiant and some other people up front, so I can have that audio go straight to that camera for better syncing. Because if you have a really long lens in the very back of, let's say, an outdoor venue, you're probably not going to be able to hear a lot of what they're saying, and it might be really hard to sync that footage. So having a way to have good audio on your far away cameras so that you can sync it in post is going to be really helpful so that you don't get stuck having to manually sync everything. But I put shotgun mics on the cameras because it does give me a little bit better audio and it doesn't make it as echoey, especially if you're inside like this, because a lot of internal audio devices on cameras will be in stereo, which it'll hear a lot of your echoes and other things, and having the directional mics is going to make your audio a little bit better. Maybe not 100% usable, but it is a better backup than nothing, or better backup than your in-camera audio. And then we move on to the bread and butter, which is actually setting up the cameras. This is probably the most important part that you are going to have to deal with, and this will vary from venue to venue. I'm sorry, but it's not an exact science, but I will give you my advice as to how I set up most of my ceremonies, or at least try to. So right here, you can see me setting up one of my cameras in the very front right of the first row. This is because people, when they stand up, will get in your way of most of your cameras unless you can put your cameras either way above them or next to them, meaning at the very first row. So I'll put my cameras at the very first row if I can, because some venues don't have the availability to do that because of the space, or they might have their first row way too close to the altar. This one was absolutely perfect, so I was able to put my camera pretty close to the end. You'll see me move it here in a second, because this lens is a little bit tighter, and so I had to move it a little bit a ways so that I could have a little bit wider of a shot so that it would show everything when the bride comes down the aisle. And then after she comes down the aisle, since it is a zoom lens, I will zoom in a bit to zoom more on her face. But having that wider shot in the beginning allows it to not have to miss moments or miss focus or miss things because it's too tight, because you'll never get the exact spot where the couples will be standing. So I always like to say, try to go wider first and then zoom in later, because that's going to save your butt with not missing a shot on one of your cameras, especially if that shot is something you really needed. So The second lens here, or the second camera, this one's going to get set up on the opposite side, on the left side, so I can get the other bride or groom's reaction. So my right camera will be getting the bride in this case, and my left camera will be getting the groom. The left camera here, though, is on a 85mm prime lens, so I had to put it at a very specific distance and spot because you can't change the focal distance. But I was able to get to a spot where I would have basically like a chest up shot of the groom, a little bit wider, I believe it ended up being, and it allowed me to get that reaction of him. So this shot is both good to get the reaction of the groom if you don't have a second shooter, because nobody will most likely be in the way of it. However, you do have to keep in mind that the bridal party might also get in the way of that shot. So you always want to try to strategically place these cameras so that people don't get in the way of it, because these are going to be your safety shots in case you can't get both the bride and groom's reaction walking down the aisle or something along those lines, especially if you're a solo shooter. In my case, I had a second shooter and I had them specifically look at the groom while she was walking down the aisle so that I could focus on the bride. And then a few things happened here. First, I went and just briefly kind of set up my long 7200 lens. Usually that goes in the very back because it is the longest lens and it has a nice look when you can zoom straight down the aisle or from somewhere above, like a balcony in a church or something like that. But I didn't have the camera for that yet because it was still on my gimbal, so I waited to put that on. And then I went over to the DJ for another really important aspect of a ceremony. I had to set up to the DJ board. And when setting up with the DJ board, there's a multitude of cables you can utilize. There's usually RCA, there's XLR, there's 1/4 inch and 3.5mm like a headphone. Normally, you're going to be using XLR. The second most used is most likely RCA, and then 1/4 inch, and then 3.5mm. In my case, I used RCA, and I plugged directly into their output, their master out. I always want to plug into the master out because it's going to be the cleanest output, and if they do change a setting that changes the master output, then it'll change the actual everything in the ceremony. Like everybody, all the guests will hear that change. Whereas if you plug into something like the phone's output, that's basically like a headphone output that you would hear through headphones, and sometimes the DJs can accidentally have that too loud or too quiet or change it in mid-ceremony, and that can really mess up the audio you get because you can't control that while you're working the actual ceremony. So doing a master out is best. Second best is going out of the speaker itself via XLR, and then the third obviously would be, phone's output. So always try to do your master output and go from there. And now you'll start seeing me running around like a chicken with its head cut off because the music started to play, which means the ceremony is about to start, which means I need to go start recording on all of my cameras. And during this time, I'm also making sure all of the settings are still set to what I put them at. Previously, when I was setting up all of my cameras in each spot, I also turned on all of the cameras and set the settings to make sure that they were what they needed to be. Now, the key here is to match some of the settings for all of your cameras. For example, you should be matching your white balance on all of your cameras because trying to match your white balance after the fact is a really, really frustrating process. However, the exposure may change based on the lens you have and what aperture it can be at. But you definitely want to match your white balance, and then also make sure your autofocus or focus point is set to where you want it to be. And if you're using manual focus, make sure you reset that after the people get in the spots they need to be. But right here, I'm basically just going through, hitting record on all of my 4 cameras, making sure all of the settings still look good and that the exposure looks good. And I'm basically double checking this because you don't really want to have to move around to all of your cameras throughout the entire ceremony. You're going to be wanting to go get shots and, the angles and the cool things, the rings getting put on, the first kiss, all of that. So you don't want to have to run around doing that. So make sure that your cameras have the settings that you want and it looks good and that they're all recording. Double check it if you have to, and then start getting your other shots. Now, during the ceremony, I will often go through and check through my cameras to make sure they're still recording, they're in focus and things like that, unless the ceremony is super short. This one was only about 10 minutes long, so it was really, really short, and I basically had no time to check my cameras. However, some ceremonies are 30 minutes to an hour, or maybe even an hour and a half long, so you're going to want to check through those cameras multiple times to make sure that the focus is still good and that they're still recording, because that has happened many times to me where I go to a camera and it stopped recording for some reason, or the focus was completely off. So you don't want a camera to have basically useless footage for a huge portion of the ceremony. It's okay if it happens here and there, but then you're down to 3 cameras instead of 4 or 2 or however many you have because one camera stopped giving you good footage. So always want to make sure that you're good to go. Don't try to rush that process. And then finally here, you see me on a different camera setting up my mics with the people I need mics on. So as far as audio goes, I have mics on all of my cameras, and then I put a wireless mic that is recording internally on the Groom, and I put a 32-bit recorder on the Groom as well via an actual lav mic, and then I also put a wireless mic inside the Officiant's jacket. Now, ideally, I would like to put a full mic on the Officiant, and obviously I already have one on the Groom, and then sometimes it doesn't hurt to also put one on the Bride if you have a white mic that can blend in or not be seen, but I don't have that option right now, or did I have the time to do that at this wedding? But I had the DJ board as well, and I was pretty confident I was going to get good audio out of that. So I wasn't too worried about the other types of audio that, you know, you could get, because I was confident with the audio that I had, other than having to change a battery real quick in my lav mic. But having more audio sources than you need is always going to be great, no matter how you have to do it. Sometimes I even put my audio recorders straight on a speaker. The wireless mics from DJI have magnets on them, and sometimes I'll just stick them straight to the speaker because that's better audio than nothing. You know, it's always a good backup to have, and it's always good to have multiple backups because a good video is not a good video with bad audio. It's a pretty good saying in the industry, so you just want to make sure you have a solid source of audio and make sure it's done. Now, for the Officiant, he was using a wireless mic that was going for the ceremony, so putting another lav on him is just kind of an annoying situation, so I just put the wireless mic inside his jacket pocket. Same with the Groom, I put one inside of his jacket pocket, and I put a regular lav on, but I also tried fixing his boutonniere because his little needle was sticking through his jacket and probably going to poke him in the side, which is not great. But after I put this on and made sure everything was recording, I left and went to get all of the rest of stuff set up. But for the most part, that is generally how I set up for a ceremony, and that is everything that I do for the most part for every ceremony. I'll be putting out more videos like this to teach you a little bit more about ceremonies or just different wedding setups, but that's really it for this video, and I hope you learned something. If you have questions, put it in the comment section down below, and we'll see you guys on the next one.